Hello there, welcome to another episode of Q&A about um, business innovation and managing life. So I'm happy to try and take questions about any of those topics. And I see we have quite a number saved up from before. Let's see. Oh, it's a question. So you ask me difficult things here. Techrific asks me, what are my thoughts on GDPR and general hostility toward cloud technologies in the EU and so on? Boy, well, you know, there's always this challenge, and there has become a challenge in business of sort of where does the value lie? What do you get paid for actually doing, and so on. And back in the day, it was sort of simple because people kind of made widgets, or they made physical things. They cost something to make. They sold them to people for more than they cost to make if they were lucky, and it was all quite simple. And then along came things like software, where the specific unit cost of making something is zero. When you do cloud computing, you know, cloud kinds of things, it isn't quite zero. But if you do, even when you're downloading software, it's not actually identically zero because it costs something to arrange for the download, but it's really close to zero. It's certainly nothing like the kinds of fractional costs that are involved in making physical objects. So, you know, that opened up all kinds of new potential models for how to do business, in which you're giving people things, you're not charging them for that, but you're getting the money somewhere else, and so on. And I mean, the classic examples of that are things like the kind of, you know, we'll provide a service and we'll make money by capturing user data, by using that to sell ads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where in a sense, the customer is not the customer, so to speak. The person who is using the social network or using the search engine or whatever is not the actual customer for the company that makes that thing. The actual customer for that company ends up being the advertiser or the outfit that wants data on the users and things like this. And it creates all sorts of strange incentives. And I think, you know, in my life in business, so to speak, you know, I've tried to keep the incentives as aligned as possible. That is, the things we make, the software we make, the technology we make that commercial by selling it to people who are going to use it, rather than some more complicated third-party kind of mechanism where we're giving things away and we're making money on ads or whatever else. Now, there are things we give away, like Wolfram Alpha, for example, where at least the web version, the basic web version of that, where I view that as being partly philanthropy and partly kind of a look at all the cool stuff we can do, use our other technology. It doesn't work so well for that particular purpose. It's I think people just say, thanks for giving this to the world, and that's, you know, I'm happy with that too. Although it would be nice if it led more directly to people saying, you know, oh, how does this Wolfram Alpha thing work? You know, maybe I should be using the technology behind it. That does happen at the kind of the enterprise level, of people saying it's a very good generator of kind of very interesting kinds of projects. Of you know, CEO of large company X sees Wolfram Alpha and says, why can't I do something like this of just asking natural language questions about our internal corporate data combined with sort of external data, and that's so that's a good thing. But you know, the issue that comes up when sort of the customer isn't the customer, one ends up with all kinds of issues, and some of these things about data privacy is one of the kinds of things that happens there. I think that you know, what we have done, because it isn't our business to, you know, let's say Wolfram Alpha queries, for example, it's not our business to go and do something where we're dealing with advertising and this, that, and the other. So it's always been rather simple for us. We can sort of keep queries private and throw away data and so on. It doesn't really make any difference. But if our model of business involved sort of the customers aren't the customers, but the customers are needing that data, then we've got a different situation on our hands. Now, I think that when people say that isn't good for our country or whatever, and our shouldn't be set up so that people capture this kind of data or that kind of data, then you've got then you've got the idea of, okay, let's put in a regulation that says you can't do this or can do that. Typically, these regulations tend to be rather blunt instruments, and there's obviously a giant industry in the world of when it comes to regulations about taxes or something like that. There's a giant industry of sort of figuring out what exactly is the regulation and how do we optimize things to be sort of skating on the side of that or whatever else. I think in my own observation about things like GDPR is that sort of what it might have been intended to do, I'm not sure it really achieved. I think there's this concept of sort of getting approval from a user. If you've got a big enough network with tentacles that reach far enough out, somewhere in your big enough network, there's some tentacle that will have given approval, and then the way that those rules were written, it sort of allows the whole octopus to have approval, so to speak. And the thing that I noticed when GDPR was coming in is that every EU-based kind of small charity and things like that was sending sort of panicked emails saying, help, please contact us, because otherwise we'll never be able to interact with you again. And I'm not sure that was a correct reading of the regulations, but at least that's what people thought was going to happen. So that was kind of to my mind, kind of a blunt instrument, which did not have the effect of sort of clipping the, I was going to say the wings of the octopus, but that's a bad analogy there. I don't think it had the effect of reining in sort of very large-scale data collection efforts, but did have the effect of causing trouble, at least, or concern on the part of smaller-scale operations. So I think this whole question about cloud technologies and centralization versus not, and so on, it's a strange thing because when I started using computers back in the 1960s, early 1970s. There were, computers were big, they were expensive. Most computing was done in this kind of batch processing mainframe type mode, where there was a central computer, and everybody was using that same centralized computer. And then the personal computer revolution happened, and workstation computers came about, and so on, and everybody had their own computer. And now we're sort of more back to the situation where there's lots of centralized computing. And there are sort of reasons of economy of scale for doing that. I mean, if you take Wolfram Alpha, for example, we've got many, many terabytes of data about the world and so on. We've got all kinds of feeds that come in and all kinds of other things like that. And and in fact, for doing our natural language understanding and so on, we have to have lots of stuff in memory to do things efficiently. You need big computers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It isn't, in the current state of things, it's not realistic to have that be distributed to sort of everybody's personal computer. So that's one example of where centralization is useful. But also what's become increasingly clear in recent years is that kind of system administration and so on is complicated, and the centralization of that is of value. And that's a reason why people don't want to administer their own computers and so on. And so that's another reason to drive towards cloud kinds of things. I have to say that I've tended to avoid using those for services at our company, using sort of outside cloud services very much. I tend to think if you have a software company of a certain size and you have enough technical capabilities, it will end up being better and even cheaper to use your own in-house stuff, and perhaps safer to use your own in-house stuff than to have it all out there on somebody else's cloud, so to speak. But I think I'm not sure what the sort of critical point is. Maybe it's 500 employees, maybe it's a few hundred employees, maybe I don't know where it is, where it seems to me it's a little bit, it's not clear you need that particular economy of having, you're going to have your own system administration group, DevOps, team and so on in-house anyway. And so it doesn't really help you very much to just not happen to own the computers and so on. But I think a thing that there are certainly beliefs about the world of certain kinds of services where people say it's got to be centralized or it can't work. And it's sort of interesting to see that there's been a big trend towards everything AI-ish must be centralized. And that's sort of, oh, well, you've got to do sort of large scale training, you've got to pull in the data centrally and so on. I'm not sure that's really true. I'm not sure that's a technological question. And I think, when it comes to different kinds of things in the world, it could have been the case that the web was completely centralized, that there was just, a computer somewhere that was sort of serving all websites, so to speak, or email could have been centralized. There's an email, system, and you could have said, oh, you'll never be able to exchange email with people unless you had sort of one central email system somewhere in the world that was exchanging those things. But in fact, those systems got set up very well in a distributed way. In the current sort of social networks, for example, are very centralized. Not clear technologically, it doesn't have to be that way. That's been something that has been, I would say, more of a business optimization than has been a technology optimization. And that's something that has led to, well, all sorts of dynamics of tech companies bigger than countries, all these kinds of things. And it's not clear that it has to be that way, so to speak. There are economic forces that make that, that push one in that direction, but there are other things which might make one concerned about that direction. And I think that's sort of part of what one's seeing in, I think one of the things about cloud services is that as one sees those becoming centralized resources that are big and financially, commercially big, and sort of countries look at this and it's like, gosh, this is a big force in our world. And as a country, are we sort of giving something up by not somehow controlling what's going on with this? And you see that, in China, you certainly see that in the difficulty of, cloud services in China are very much not, as of like, we can't operate stuff there. And it's difficult for, it's something where there's a definite set of regulations, from the government there. And I think that's something, as you look at that in different countries around the world, there are all sorts of different things that people talk about doing and have tried to do and so on with respect to sort of controlling this obviously increasingly important resource. It's worth remembering historically, it used to be the case that in most countries, the telecom systems were all government controlled. In England, where I grew up, it was the GPO. What would that stand for? The General Post Office or something? I'm not sure. That controlled. Gosh, I'm forgetting this. It's been so long. But the whole, the phone network was all a government thing. Whereas in the US, for example, it was a large private company, AT&T, and then later different pieces and so on. And I think that's been a sort of the realization that as one with the technology that's caused people, technology plus business that's caused this centralization, it becomes something that's sort of government level stuff. Now, how that relates to blockchain and the sort of government disconnected kind of world of government disconnected and very global world of sort of decentralized services, that's an interesting question. And it seems to be still, and that's kind of the opportunity to have something that is sort of separately set up. The concept that somehow there are commercial forces at work there as well, and what they will lead to, I think, is still not completely clear. And we've been quite involved in that. And there are questions like, for example, one that I've been interested in recently is how does blockchain relate to the future of software licensing? I think there are some really interesting things that can be done there. I think there are interesting things with respect to kind of the world of open source versus, again, our approach has been to have something which is fundamentally a piece of it's a proprietary software system where what we are doing is to make, we're producing something where we're selling it to people who use it. And that's been a very good and effective way to kind of get us a setup where we can continue to do R&D now for 35 years on on that product is to have something where the sort of the ecosystem is that's sort of been built is one where the people who are using our stuff are paying us to make more of our stuff, so to speak, rather than we made something and actually the less well it works, the better, because we're really making money selling services or some such other thing. For me, it's a much simpler setup, and one that leads one, I think, to generate more effective kind of innovative value for the world. But there's sort of a question of how in that setup, what is the best way to, for example, deliver final value? How do people sort of who are developing things with our technology, how do they most benefit, and other ways to do that using kind of blockchain type ideas and so on. Let's see. Aaron is saying that I'm looking better groomed today than I have been. I think yes, I was. It's one of these things where I suppose it's sometimes there's a certain question of, you know, how carefully do you need to, you know, have that fine suit? I think I barely own a suit. I think I do own one. But you know, how important is it for one to make the right impression with the right kind of tie and so on? I remember chap I knew who actually was he had a double life. He both ran a large academic organization and sort of had a separate life of working with investment funds and so on. And I think I was the only person in his sort of world who knew about both parts of his life, and he was always nervous about particularly the academic side of his life, finding out that he really was off doing these things with investments. But he particularly enjoyed telling me, you know, for this kind of meeting with in this world you wear this color of tie, for that kind of meeting in that world you wear that color of tie. But I think somehow perhaps the world has evolved to a point where these things in most industries make less of a difference. Although I'm always interested to see, you know, some kinds of industries, you know, everybody's wearing a dark suit or the analog, and in other places almost there's a sort of a there's equally well sort of the casual uniform of different kinds of things. I'm not sure that is I suppose I end up personally tending to be a none of the above type character when it comes to, you know, is this person classified as a this or a this or a this or a this? And so I think I have the theory that I get to make up my own rules about that, so I don't pay as much attention to it perhaps as I might, you know, I think for some reason maybe, you know, well, it's not something where, like, my wife is not telling me, oh, you're looking totally shaggy, you should go get a haircut. Maybe some people's spouses are more do that. Mine doesn't happen to do that. So let's see. And is asking, talking about the perception of CEOs within their own companies and in the public eye, how does one maintain leadership and reputation when people rely on one's decisions? You know, those are interesting questions. I think one of the things is there's a certain, I'll give you an example. Well, okay. The first question is, well, you know, you're often, you have to make decisions, you have to, and often you're doing that with incomplete information, and you're not absolutely certain you've got the right answer. I think one thing I've noticed is, so long as your level of certainty is reasonably high, it's better to just say, you know, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're doing it, et cetera, rather than, oh, I'm not really sure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When the level of certainty goes down enough, it's really important to say, look, there are two things we could do here, and we're going to do this one, but that might not be the right answer. It might be the other one. But there's no point in saying of every decision, oh, there's a possibility that I'm wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of a very, it's not a great way to, I think most people don't really, they're perfectly happy. Decision's been made. They're going to do something sort of under that decision, so to speak, and it's fine to do that going forward. I think that there are cases where you're pretty certain, that there's a 40% chance you're wrong. Well, don't just jump forward and say we made this decision. It's only fair to the people involved to basically say, look, this is the decision we're going to make, but it could well not be the right decision. But I think, so I think that there's a certain degree of just do a definite thing. Now, I've seen plenty of cases in my life where I'm kind of worried because things are kind of complicated and there's some turmoil about something and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've noticed that people really do appreciate it when one just says, this is what we're going to do. And, there are all kinds of things and there's a worry about this and it might be that or whatever. But it's like there's a sort of, I think people appreciate so the definitiveness of this is what we're going to do and let's work out all the consequences of that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think that we'll give you another example of an issue. So back in the day, I used to, I like to know everybody who works at our company. That's not all that realistic with the number of people we have. There's maybe 800 people or something. It's and certainly since I've been a remote CEO for 31 years, I'm not like wandering around, different offices and things. And we're a very geo-distributed company anyway. But I either if I'm wandering around the office in person or for a little while, I had a telepresence robot that worked rather poorly actually for wandering around the office. So back in the day, I really used to make a point of wandering around, talking to people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I noticed an example of a thing that goes wrong is you'd think, I like to know people who work at our company, not least because I'm always interested in seeing talent develop. And, there's some tremendously talented junior person who, really could be moved into some more sort of higher position, so to speak, in some different place. And they've obviously got lots of talent and so on. And it's good to be able to notice that. But one of the flip sides of that is you go around, you chat with people, you're chatting with somebody, and you're like they're telling you what they're working on, and you get all interested in one particular aspect of it. And next thing you know is the manager or the manager of the manager of that person is complaining, how come you told that person to concentrate on doing this rather than the main part of their job type thing? And that's kind of okay, not such a good idea. Difficult to a difficult kind of, you have to be sort of careful in what you do in those kinds of communications, because you set up a whole structure for making the organization run, and to sort of jump in and derail some piece of it unless something has gone very wrong there. Something's gone very wrong there, then you sort of have to do that. But if it hasn't, there's no that's sort of a bad thing to do. And I think another piece of perhaps, I don't know, there's sort of unexpected aspects of the, I think one often sort of leads by example, and I tend to be, I work very hard, and I tend to be quite, I tend to push myself to do all sorts of difficult things, and I push other people to do all sorts of difficult things as well. And that seems to me to make sense. I kind of like to believe that I'm not kind of telling people, oh, go do this thing, when I would never do that myself or could never do that myself. I think it's much better to be sort of encouraging people and asking people to do things where it's like, well, I wouldn't mind doing that myself, but I can't do all these things. So it's like you get to do that thing rather than me, so to speak. I think that there are all kinds of questions about what one should delegate versus not. And, one of the things that is sometimes difficult in learning to do management is what should you delegate? Now, there are situations where people say, I have no choice but to delegate. I don't know anything about that particular thing that I'm delegating about. I have to say, I don't think that's the best situation. I've certainly found in my own life that things that I really don't understand, where I'm sort of delegating them to somebody else, it's that doesn't go nearly as well as things which I basically understand, even though I might not have all of the details, and I'm certainly not going to put all the time in to working all the things out. But it's easier to delegate well if you understand the things you're delegating and could, in principle, go do that job if you had to, so to speak. But there's also the question of, you can do something well. Okay, you delegate it to somebody else. They maybe are not as experienced. They can't do it quite as well. What's the relative value of the time you save by delegating versus the loss of quality of execution, for example, that you get by having somebody other than you do it? Or maybe it's an increase in quality of execution because that person's really pretty good at doing it, or they're going to put more effort into it, or whatever else. But that's a thing which I would say over the years, I've gotten better at figuring this out, but it's not a simple thing. And there's particularly one of the paradoxes of that is that as one oneself gets more experienced, it becomes faster to do many kinds of things that one might otherwise be delegating to do them oneself, because one has the experience, I just do boom, 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 this is what I can do. And so for me, for a long time, I had taken the point of view, first of all, I sort of have a point of view that if I can delegate, I should delegate, because there's plenty that I cannot delegate. And so if it's delegatable, try and delegate it. But then the thing that can go wrong is you delegate something and it's really hard. It turns out it's really much harder than expected. Turns out there's some horrible, problem that you just can't get, the people you delegated to just can't get resolved. The thing you have to do is make sure that can come back to you, that they don't just try and sort of noodle around thinking about it for 3 months and then, oops, we couldn't figure it out, sorry, type thing, but that they don't get, that they're not don't feel bad about saying, look, this is pretty difficult. Can you help us figure this out? I think I consider myself to have succeeded in some ways in management when I do get people coming back to me and saying, this turned out to be much harder than you thought. What did you imagine was actually going to happen? And I look at it and like, yeah, you're right. I should have figured that out, but I didn't. It's much more difficult. Let's go try and figure it out. And sometimes I used to think that in cases where I sort of had to parachute in or decided to parachute in and try and solve some problem that had been a big festering problem somewhere, that people would be like, oh my gosh, we'll never be able to learn how to do anything because the CEO is always going to parachute in and solve all the difficult problems, or nobody would ever sort of try solving difficult problems themselves. But in fact, that isn't what's happened. Instead, I think people are maybe even charmed that I'm prepared to go in, and I know we just started actually a more formalized system of when there are sort of bugs and things that have just been rattling around for a really, really long time, that I've sort of signed myself up to say, okay, I'm going to try and solve these. And I've so far, we'll see if it continues, but the times when we've had this sort of formalized process now for doing this, the times I've ended up doing it, it turns out, yes, I actually managed to solve it, or at least get us on a track to being able to solve it. And, how can I do that? Well, I've had lots of experience by now. I also know about a lot of different kinds of things, and a lot of cases where there's some nasty problem, bug, issue, whatever, the thing is not going to be solved by just drilling with what in one particular area. One's going to have to think more globally about what's possible. I mean, I would say another thing about delegating things that can get difficult is you imagine this is what we should do. Some particular thing should get done. And so you say to somebody, can you do this particular thing? Well, it turns out that particular thing is really difficult. But unless you explain why you care about that particular thing, the person will just keep drilling. Can I do that particular thing? if they knew why one cared, they might be able to say, hey, wait a minute, if we do something just a tiny bit away from that, it'll be easy. You know, if we redefine what this product is supposed to be just a little bit, we redefine what what this function is supposed to do, whatever else it is, by just a little bit, we've got an easy path. But if you just sort of fire and forget delegated that thing, and the person will go off and try and make it work, and it often that's a bad thing. And so I certainly like to try, when I'm delegating things, to explain why we're doing what we're doing. Some people, depending on their background, depending on what the kinds of topics are, some people will really understand that well, and some people will be like, just tell me what to do, and then without understanding that stuff. And it's certainly better, I think. But of course, the other thing that can happen is, if you explain too much why you're doing something, the person will be like, oh, well, maybe we should do it differently. We should do this, we should do that, we should do the other thing. It's like, look, I kind of figured out what we should do. I'm pretty sure this is right. Just go try and do this. Don't spend a lot of resources, don't spin a lot of wheels, kind of rethinking what I think I already figured out. That's just a waste of time, so to speak. So, but the pure kind of just do this and ask no questions, so to speak, is not great. But nor is the let's noodle over the decision for 3 weeks and never get anything done. And sometimes I always notice when there's a certain type of thing that I'll give somebody or some group or something to do, and no questions come back. I'm always like, something's wrong here, because I know that there are going to be issues, and and there are. It's for me at least. It's easier when there are too many questions, and you have to tell people, as I've done many times, like, look, you're asking me these questions. You ask me this question. What do you think the answer to that question is? They tell you. You say, yeah, that's right. Okay, the next, rather than asking me that question, asking me questions over and over again, it's like, you're at the point where you're going to be able to get the right answer most of the time. You don't need to ask me. And sometimes people will still keep asking a bit, but I think it's an important thing to communicate to people, the point when they really don't have to ask you, because they're you're going to agree with their answer most of the time. And what you hope for is that there are times when people will, and many people I work with and worked with for many years, have sort of know well at what point they know what they know, and they know what they don't know, and they know what they kind of want to ask me and so on, and what they don't need to ask me about. So at least that's that kind of thing. Now, I mean, I suppose that it, in terms of leadership, and it really helps when one can actually do stuff oneself. And in our particular organization, we basically don't have any sort of pure managers, so to speak. The people who are leading things are also doing things, I suppose that's I'm a big example of that, because I'm actually doing software design. I'm doing a bunch of sort of basic science and R&D and so on. I'm doing a whole bunch of writing. I'm doing a fair amount of kind of outside presentation of things, although I don't get involved in the kind of the nitty gritty of our commercial operations. I kind of made that as a principle for our company many years ago, that I could spend all of my time, because that's a typical thing that a person who's leading a company like ours would do. I could spend all of my time, meeting with customers and doing commercial kinds of things. And I said, I'm simply not going to do that. That's something I'm going to delegate. I hope I can find good people to do that. But it's a sort of a life decision that I'm going to concentrate on the sort of making products, figuring out things strategically, so to speak, rather than on the kind of the sort of person-to-person type aspects of the commercial things that we have to do. Let's see. Well, PJ is asking, have I ever felt that I was working on too many projects at one time? They say they're developing 3 different products right now, But is one project at a time better in your experience? I think if you're doing it just yourself, for me, and people may vary on this, but for me, I cannot deal with a huge number of high intensity projects at the same time. I much prefer to push to get a project done. That one's finished, go on to the next one. Because for me, I'm building up a lot of kind of internal state information as I work on some particular thing with intensity. And if I try and sort of, if I try and kind of switch to something different, I lose a lot of that state. So I like to be kind of a sequential worker. Now, when you're working with other people, that's often not possible. And so what my life tends to be, I'm working on some particular thing myself with high intensity, and then I'm working myself with maybe people helping me on that project. But then there are lots of other projects that I'm involved in kind of providing leadership for, but they're projects which, if I disappear for a month, those projects still have a path that they're keeping going on. They're not projects where I'm pulling them, forward. They're projects that are under their own steam, but I'm kind of helping to direct them rather than being the one who's actually pulling them step by step to the next piece. I think that when a project can be something where you can feel like, even if I do nothing for a month, even things will have happened with that project, then those are ones that I feel like I can do in parallel with others. Where there are ones where it's like my personal effort is needed every single day to make this project move forward, those are ones where I tend to try and do them sequentially, so to speak. Now, I think one of the things that can happen, is very frustrating actually, is that you're doing one of these ones that's sort of a high intensity project, but it needs a sort of sub piece. And that sub piece relies on other people, and that sub piece isn't under your control. I can work as hard as I want. I can, I can work hours and hours and hours, days and days and days on it. It's not going to do any good because that part is being done by other people. And for whatever reason, they're not going to deliver their results for another week, 2 weeks, whatever else it is, month, whatever. In fact, I'm right now, just this week, in the middle of such a situation where there's a project, some very good people are working on sort of a piece of it, trying to bring it to completion. It's a very abstract project, big project about mathematics and the kind of sort of a realization that we can make kind of a bit of progress on something which has been kind of in some direction for the last 100 years or so. I think we have a somewhat different direction, but this is a big project. It's a couple of 100-page document, and it's in the stage of sort of cleaning up all of the graphics and code and things that goes into it. And I've kind of finished my part, and there's a bunch of cleanup to be done, but then I have to come back in and sort of try and make sure everything is consistent at the end. And so I'm in kind of the state of I'm waiting for other people who are doing very well at it, but it's, I'm just waiting. And so I literally had to make this decision last weekend. Do I start another project even as this one is not finished, or do I sort of put myself in a wait state until that project is finished? Because that project just requires a huge amount of kind of internal state for me to remember what's going on with it, and for me to sort of do a good job of finishing it off. So in the end, I decided I did start looking at another project, then decided I'm not going to do this. I'm going to take, I always accumulate vastly too much email. I get many hundreds of messages per day. And what ends up happening is I sort of triage off the ones that are fairly simple to respond to. And then there's this collection of compacted email that builds up that is sort of progressively more and more difficult, and progressively requires more and more effort to respond to. And, at a good time, I'll maybe have 500 compacted messages. At a bad time, my sort of total pending messages will go up into the 3,000-4,000 range. And then I have all this sort of personal analytics data where I can see, I find it rather satisfying to look at the plot of, pending email, and you can see all these big cliffs when I really worked very hard to get it down and so on. But so I decided I would do that. So people who might have been, I think the earliest email I responded to was from 2008. although most of it is from the last year or so. And so that was my kind of something I had to get done sometime. And that was what I sort of did in order to avoid myself getting diverted from knowing about this one project that I'm trying to get finished. As soon as that project is finished, the day it's finished, I'll go on and start another project. I think, so for me, it's easier to do things somewhat sequentially when I am the driving force. When there are other people providing leadership for the project, that's not necessary, and it's much more efficient to run a bunch of things in parallel. So that's my comment on that. There's a question here about from JT about what's my ideal business size? How many employees? Is there a sweet spot? I think companies go through, there are different things that happen at different sizes. Like below 50 people, you kind of know everybody. Below, I don't know, 20 people or something, everybody's sort of special and different, and there are many sort of single points of failure. When you're down at sort of 5 people or something, it's a much more personal experience with people. When you get above maybe, I don't know, a few hundred people, 500, I don't know, a few hundred, there, if you have things set up properly, there are rather few single points of failure. There are rather few places where, oh gosh, nobody could pick up that thing if that person disappeared or whatever. I think from a CEO point of view, there's probably, I don't know how many people I directly work with. I'm sure I have that data, but I'm guessing it's, I don't know, 50, 100, maybe 150 or something, people that I'm routinely in meetings with and things like this. And then there's, another, our company is like 800 people altogether. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who are part of those organizations and are doing, super valuable work, but it's just like I'm not interfacing directly with them. And so at some level, there could be more of those people, and it would be invisible to me as, as a CEO, so to speak. And I think the things that then tend to happen is the more people there are, I think, 800 is the largest of the company I've run, so I can't speak from personal experience for larger companies. I can only talk about things I've seen and things friends of mine deal with in running larger companies. I think sort of the difficulty of turning the ship and so on changes as the company gets bigger, and the kinds of issues that you run into change, when you're really, and the level of sort of precision that you have to operate at with respect to all kinds of structuring kinds of things changes. The extent to which everything has to have certain levels of bureaucracy and this and that and the other changes as you change the size of the company. And I think for me, I'm pretty happy at the size of company we have, which is partly why that's the size of company we have. It's sort of, for me as a CEO, it's kind of small enough that I've I think, got my arms more or less around the things we do. There are not lots of tentacles here and there where it's like, oh, I never knew what that business unit did. Oh, we have a business unit doing that, I didn't know that type thing. That doesn't really happen at a company of our size. If our company had, 10,000 employees, I'm sure there would be plenty of pieces where I would say, oh gosh, I had no idea we did that. And I suppose for me personally, with my particular interests in, building things and products and so on, it's in a sense, it's better to have a company that's small enough that it has to be large enough that it can get a lot of stuff done, and yet small enough that you can kind of see to the edges of the thing, and it's not kind of a thing where there's sort of a business unit where you didn't know what it did. Now, again, there are things that happen. I think our company should be bigger than it is. Probably it should be probably twice the size it is right now. And it's a question of I've been operating kind of a simple private company without investors or anything like that for the last 35 years. And one feature of that is it's kind of like you have to spend less than you make. And that limits the rate at which you can grow. And even in times where things are sort of where, revenues go up and everything looks very rosy, it's kind of like I tend to take the rather conservative point of view of, don't bring on board lots of people where, you can't tell what's going to happen if things aren't as rosy, next year type thing. And that's turned out to be a good strategy for the last 35 years. But I think the other question about how big a company should you have is, what is the company supposed to do? What functions? Like, for example, you take our company, you could say, well, why don't you have more people working on this or that thing? Well, we don't really know what we want to do on this or that thing. So we could pour more people into it, but they wouldn't do anything terribly useful, because it's like, that we don't have a clean enough strategy in that area to know what we should do. Now, there are things where it's obviously scalable. Like we could say, I don't know, let's say versions of Wolfram Alpha. We have ones in a few languages. We could say, let's get versions of Wolfram Alpha in another 20 languages. And it's clear we could bring in teams of people, we could do that. Whether each of those languages would be a commercial success, given what we'd have to spend to make them, it's not clear, but it's clearly something where, in a sense, you turn the knob, you get more stuff done. It's well defined what has to be done. But there are other places where you could say, well, let's have more sales folk working on this or that thing. Well, to do that, you have to have more leads. Let's do this thing. And it can be something that can happen, particularly in more commercial areas, is that you say, let's just bring on board a much bigger sales team, because then we'll sell more. Well, it turns out that's not the only problem you need to solve to sell more. But if you bring on board all those people, you're paying for all those people. And that can be really bad if you didn't solve the whole problem of how do you make that work. So, people say, and I think it also depends, optimal size of company also depends a bit on, what the mission of the company is and what the CEO's personal goals are, what the CEO can actually reasonably handle, and so on. I think for us, I'm pretty happy with the size of company we have, although I think it should be maybe a factor of 2 bigger, but not a factor of 10 bigger, because I think then we're in the, hey, do we really have a division that does that? I didn't know that, which for my kind of CEOing, I find, I'm not that interested in that. There are people where the primary goals are much more directly, purely commercial, where it's like, oh, we have a division that does that and it makes money, fantastic. That's let's have more of those type thing. Whereas for me, if we have a division that does that and it's something I just don't care about, it's not something I find interesting, then that's a thing where it's not, that doesn't that's not something I'm motivated to add in, so to speak. Now, of course, we're also in the situation where, because we don't have outside investors and things like that, where we're not trying to make money for other people, so to speak. We're kind of in a good situation in some ways, that we're able to just serve ourselves and our customers in the world, so to speak, rather than specifically, oh, we've got to make sure that the market analysts like us so that our stock price goes up type thing. And different people are under different constraints in respect of that, and particularly people who've brought in venture capital investment, things like this, have a different set of objectives that they are signed up to answer for, so to speak. So again, that can be, sometimes there's a value to having, when people just are just hiring tons and tons of people, sort of almost for the sake of having a bigger company, that tends to not end well. And sometimes when there's like, oh, we just got all this investment money, we've got to scale up and have all these people, unless you really know what they're going to do, that's sort of a crazy thing to do, although people do it all the time. It's like, can you really figure out what all these people are going to do? Are they really going to do something where you can tell that having more people doing that is actually going to lead to a better result? I mean, it's a famous claim about software development that sort of just throwing more people on the problem can slow down rather than speed up software development. That's, you know, a question of sort of how you're managing it. And, you know, there are plenty of places where sort of adding more people forces more bureaucracy, which slows the whole thing down. But on the other hand, there are other places where it's like you've just got more to do. And so you need more people to do it, and where it's a scalable thing that you've defined. Let's see. There's a question here from JT. What's your rule of thumb about changing your mind? You know, I do change my mind. I consider it one of my better attributes. I think that it is, you know, having said that, I might be seen as being quite stubborn about things. I think here's the principle. I believe that I can understand, quotes, anything. Very arrogant statement. Very, but it is my, you know, that's the way I kind of lead my life, is I expect to understand things. And when people say, oh, I'm an expert, you should do this or that or the other, it's like, let me understand that. And say, oh, no, you'll never understand it. It's like, no, you know, I've understood a lot of stuff. You know, I can learn about it. Let me understand it. You know, tell me why you're saying that. And, you know, I think it's a very worthwhile skill to have gotten to the point where you understand when you understand, and you're used to understanding things. So you're used to being kind of on that bedrock of personal understanding, and I'm not used to being in a situation where I'm sort of floating on there are words and you're saying this and you're saying that, but I don't really understand it, but I've still got to do things even though I don't understand it. I'm not used to that. I'm used to being sort of on a bedrock of personal understanding and being able to get to the point where I really have that. And that makes it much easier to know sort of when should you change your mind? You know, maybe, you know, because you really understand it. It's not like, oh, this person's saying this and that person's saying that, and I trust this person more than I trust that person. Because then you're sort of floating and you're kind of relying on all kinds of things. But at least for me, it's like, I really need to understand it. Once I really understand it, I can realize, and sometimes it's useful to me to say, okay, I really understood this, and by golly, I got it wrong. And now when I've got sort of plan B and I'm going to go in that direction, it's like, well, let me understand, why did I get it wrong? And I can understand that too. And once I can see, well, I got it wrong because I didn't know this one thing. You know, there's something about the way that kind of thing works, you know, some industry works or some type of world situation or some technological thing works. I just didn't know. And so I got it wrong. And I can understand why I got it wrong before. And that gives me confidence in changing my mind and doing something different now. Now, you know, having said that, there are things where people will say things to me, you know, you should do this, you should do that, company should do this, we should do this thing. And I will perhaps stubbornly say, no, I don't agree, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have some framework for thinking about things where that just doesn't make sense to me at that time. And sometimes it may take years before I kind of evolve to the point where my ambient understanding of things is such that, yeah, I remember this person told me that, you know, 10 years ago, and by golly, they were right and I was wrong. And I suppose one thing that's important about that is, I don't know, I have, I suppose, enough personal confidence that, you know, look, I'm not worried that, I'm not embarrassed by the fact that, you know, the person told me that 10 years ago, they were right, I didn't see it. Now I realize that they were right. Okay, great. You know, good for them. You know, kudos to them. I'm happy. I don't feel terribly, oh, I'm so embarrassed, I was such an idiot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I think that recognizing one makes mistakes and why one makes mistakes. I mean, I suppose my self-confidence is such that I might make a stupid mistake, but at least I want to be able to understand my stupidity, so to speak, and that I'll be able to do that. So I think that's but I think it is one thing within an organization about people changing their minds and so on is that there are situations in which you just don't want to push people into, you got to take a position on this, because people will dig themselves in, and and then there'll be a huge sort of pride factor of no, we really don't want to change what we're saying, and we were really right the first time and so on. And it's often much better from a management point of view to just not push for that, not push people into that kind of polarized situation, to not have them have to have an opinion about this or that thing that the company is doing. Just don't just, it's not part of their world. You don't have to talk to them about it. Just do that. And when it becomes important for them to be involved, then hopefully things will have clarified, and they won't sort of take that take a polarized position a different way. I mean, a sort of classic example in the history of our company was when we were developing Wolfram Alpha. I have to say that some of my senior management was, I pretty much was sure that they would not believe in Wolfram Alpha. And the early demos that we had were pretty pathetic. I mean, before we had our whole computational knowledge engine working, it was like you'd ask one question, it would work. You'd ask the next question, it would be a total splat. It was a thing where to make it a real thing, you had to have, you had to have carried this big thing a long way up the hill, so to speak. It wasn't possible to see little pieces of it and have it be credible, so to speak. So I made a sort of I sort of actively decided I'm not going to expose this to my management team, and I'm kind of going to, in the end, it was a little bit ridiculous because we were kind of hiding a few hundred people working on a project, and I was kind of not bringing it up very much. And that was a really good decision, because I know that had that been discussed, people said, oh, let's see a demo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really stupid. This is never going to work. And there would have been all kinds of internal pushback and people being very polarized about it and so on. And as it was, by the time it was basically finished and demoable and I could show it to people, it's like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And, everybody's excited about it. But in its embryonic phase, it was much more difficult to expose to people. I suppose that's a thing that happens quite a bit in sort of innovative projects, is if you expose them to people who are, very capable managers doing their thing, building, whatever they're building or running whatever they're running, and you show them sort of an embryonic thing, there's a great tendency to say, that's an embryonic thing, it's never going to work, it's this, and this. And, part of the story of trying to run an innovative organization is you kind of have to navigate that and not sort of feed sort of these ill-formed embryonic projects to, not expose them to everybody until they've gotten to a point where people can really see what they are and where it's possible to have a more informed opinion rather than just sort of poking at little pieces of them to see what's going on. Let's see. Chap comments that my record of being a work from home CEO is rather unique, and they're asking, has the pandemic changed my CEOing habits? The one thing that has changed is video. I have used screen sharing for, I don't know, 30 years or something, and I've been, audio plus screen sharing. That's my way of doing meetings and things like that. And that's been that way for 30 years as I've been a kind of remote work from home CEO. The one thing is that in this pandemic, as partly through sort of a desire to make sure that people felt like there was some degree of personal interaction when there wasn't much in their sort of everyday life, kind of started using video more, and I don't use it. I don't use it that much, but I do use it from time to time. And there's certain kinds of meetings that in the past would have been pure audio that I now find it useful to have video. I know some managers in our company are always like video crazy, and they're like, everybody's got to be on video, and I'm not that way. But that's been the one thing that's substantially changed, I would say. I mean, the other thing is that I've been through different phases of, traveling a lot and going and giving lots of talks and these kinds of things. And I went through a phase. I went through some long phases where I really didn't travel at all, and then phases like 15 years ago or something now, where I did a bunch of video conference talks, and that worked very well. And then people got kind of tired of video conference talks, I think, and and then it was kind of like, then I started traveling a bunch in person. And that was okay for a while. And I had actually decided in the fall of 2019 that I was going to stop doing much traveling. And also coincided with when I was working on my big physics project and so on. So when the pandemic came around, I don't think anybody noticed that. Nobody noticed that I'd stopped traveling, because everybody had stopped traveling at that point. But in any case, so the thing that then did happen, I was really, really tickled by the fact that a number of, particularly in the more science kinds of areas, a number of places very early in the pandemic were like, I remember a group in Chile, for example, organizing this very nice, elaborate sort of series of talks where I'm realizing, I've never been to Chile. I may never go to Chile, but if there was this opportunity as soon as the pandemic happened that the people there could organize these talks, bringing in people from all over the world. And so a bunch of that has happened. I would say that in some places, lots of that has happened. In some places, I feel like people have not been as kind of entrepreneurial as they could be in bringing in sort of people to interact virtually, so to speak. But I think that my home video conferencing sort of studio for giving fancy talks has been gradually upgrading itself a bit, and it's something that I expect I'll go on using, and because I think this, sort of that, so that's been a thing that has changed a bit. I would say in terms of it's had. I'm sort of almost embarrassed, because for so many people this pandemic has had such a big and often rather negative effect on the way they lead their lives, and it really has made embarrassingly little difference to me. I would say that the one thing, I suppose the other thing that's happened is, before all of this, people would kind of, who would know, our company and me and business kinds of things, would be a little bit suspicious. How could you run a company from, remotely like that? There must be something must be wrong here. And I suppose that sort of suspicion has probably gone away, because that's what everybody has realized one can do. And there are certainly a few other companies that have been for a long time quite geo-distributed, and where they, and I think, in some of these modern areas like blockchain and so on, that's become almost the norm, to be a very distributed company. I would say that I think it's a very, it's kind of it allows one to work with a very wide range of different kinds of people in different kinds of places, different points of view, different, lots of kind of diversity of all kinds, which I find really nice. Once you've kind of got a cultural rhythm of working with people remotely, and people being very much aligned on projects and things, even though they will be thousands of miles apart and might never have met, that's something that can be part of the culture of a company, and has been part of the culture of our company for a long time. And I feel like people have a certain set of shared expectations about the way things work at our company and kind of the mission that we're pursuing and so on. And that kind of knits things together in a way that sort of transcends the sort of geography of what's going on. Now, having said that, like I just had a meeting, last almost a few days ago, which involved people from many different parts of our company who've never worked together. And it wasn't the best possible meeting. I should have thought about it a little bit more before having it, because it was a kind of a brainstorming meeting that involved people from lots of different areas. And I know, one thing that happens with meetings, there's a rhythm when you start a new kind of meeting. There's always a rhythm. The first one or two can be quite rocky, and it's like, hey, nobody really knows what to expect. People don't have things prepared. People are, taking things off in random directions. by the time it's number 3 in the series, it's gotten much more productive, and then it sort of stays productive from then on out. And you have to kind of not freak out at meeting numbers 1 and 2 even. I think this particular one, which will be a repeating discussion as we figure out some things, it will be, I'm sure it will get a lot less rocky and a lot more productive going forward. But that was an example of something which perhaps, I don't know if those people have been in the office together. I don't know. Our company is large enough; they probably would not have met anyway. So I'm not sure that would have made much of a difference. Candid is asking, saying, if you don't mind me asking, candidly, I guess, what do I do to relax and unwind from business, from my business? Well, the things I do, I really like doing. And so a lot of what I'm doing is not, is producing things, creating things, figuring things out. I really like that. I can keep doing that for, 7 days a week, for, whatever it is, 14 hours a day or something. I really like that. And it's not something from which I typically feel like I have to, quotes, unwind. Now, I've developed some, I usually sort of take a dinner break between about 6 o'clock and about 8:30 local time, and I'm often doing some stuff then, but I'm not doing sort of what one might call pitched meetings, so to speak, during that time. That's the time I will, when my children were all still around, that was a good time with them. They're mostly dispersed now, so it's a smaller group, but that's a good feature there. And I think I tend to, I found I'm a very habitual character. And so I almost can tell, when it's getting close to 8:30, I'm going to go back to work, and I kind of know I'm ready to sort of re-engage on something. I'll often be processing email and things like that as I'm kind of doing other things during my, quotes, dinner break. I suppose I also, I've generally for many years had the practice of going to see one movie per week. I never watched television or any of those kinds of things, but so sort of one movie per week for a long time, although that got a bit disrupted during the pandemic. But I found that to be, it's I find it a useful way to have some level of kind of knowledge of what people are seeing out there in the world, and some sorts of taking the temperature of some kinds of things in the world, and also from time to time it's a good kind of conversation point and kind of cultural reference point for things to help explain oneself and such like. And I suppose I've had I have a few other hobbies, like these live streams are an example of a hobby of mine, so to speak, which I find fun. Hopefully people find them interesting. But I find it interesting when people ask even the question you're asking right now. It gets me to actually engage and think about how does that work? And I find, I do a certain amount of mentoring of mostly CEOs and kids, two categories of people where sort of anything is possible, at least from their point of view. And that's something that's also sort of in a sense hobby category. And I do I've been doing a certain amount of stuff with groups of kids, because I find kids interesting, and they have a fresh point of view about things, and they don't have they're not kind of locked into a lot of the kind of it has to work this way kind of thing. And I find that's a good way to keep my own thinking perhaps a bit fresher by the fact that I'm kind of having to explain myself. And it's like they'll ask an obvious question that seems to them obvious. And it's like, I never thought of that before. I should, let me figure out an answer to that. So those are some things that I've tended to do to, quotes, unwind. I perhaps because the things that I end up doing for work are things that I really like doing. I don't need as much, perhaps, quotes, unwinding time as I might. Now, the things I do in the CEOing world, there are things that I do that are much more kind of business management-y type things. Although I have to say that what I found is that sort of a small number of decent judgment calls goes a long way, particularly when you have very talented people working with you. And I don't find that I'm spending, a huge amount of time, just big slabs of time doing what would be sort of the traditional business kinds of activities. I'm sort of reviewing projects all the time. I'm getting all kinds of email that asks me, do you approve this thing? And, what should we do about this? And so on. But those are pretty quick to respond to. And I think one of the things that has definitely sped up as I've gotten more experienced in making decisions, it's like some question comes in, what should we do? Okay. I can kind of, it doesn't take me very long to say, I think we should do this. And then on we go, respond to the email off, or sometimes I'll say this is kind of too complicated. We have to have a meeting to discuss it. But often, this making decisions quickly kind of minimizes the time spent on what might be thought of as sort of traditional business activities. I mean, there will be the occasional thing where there is sort of I don't know, both with people and with projects where things are like, oh, it has to be recovered from being off track and so on. Those are very high value moments, and I don't resent spending time on them. I mean, that when things are, you've got some big project and something went off track and you've got to try and recover it and things, I know perfectly well that takes sort of all of my experience and skill to be able to do that. It feels quite fulfilling to be able to be successful at it. It's not something that that produces, that where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is very painful. I have to unwind from it, so to speak. I think in general, I'm pleased when I feel like the things I'm doing are things that I'm fairly uniquely suited to doing, and not things where, oh, I should have delegated that, or somebody else should be doing this. And that's sort of when I am doing things that I feel like I'm sort of, they're actually making use of what skills I have, that feels pretty good, and it honestly generates probably energy for me as I see, I did this. I've noticed quite often when I'm doing some project and the project is just getting finished and it's all coming together and so on, there's a sort of boost of energy from that kind of carries me. I often use that boost. It's like a little piece of momentum from, some people might say, you've done a big project. When you finish the project, you should relax. I kind of tend to do the exact opposite. I kind of use the momentum from the excitement of having, wow, I finished that project. That's so cool, to like immediately, same day. Okay, let me start the next project, because it kind of helps me. It's kind of like a, running roller coaster down a hill, up a hill type thing. It helps me to kind of aggressively get started on the next project, that I've got that extra boost of energy from having finished the previous project. It's kind of like the irony of the wrap party. In fact, I just noticed that 25th of February will be the 20th anniversary of the wrap party for the finishing of my big book, New Kind of Science, which took about a decade to write. And we just found some pictures taken at that party. I was actually very pleased to see that the majority of people who are in those pictures are still working with me today. Most of the exceptions are people who've retired from our company. So that was a nice thing to see. But the thing about wrap parties, we used to do these for software products, and the following horrendous thing used to happen pretty much every time. It's like, you have to set the party a certain time in advance. And it's like, we're going to do a party at this moment for this finishing of this project. And then, that moment comes, and actually there are a few things that are still outstanding, little tentacles that are still tail that's still sticking out. And the people who are like often the most critical people on the project, they have to be, working really, really hard on that, on dealing with that tail, and they don't get to come to the wrap party. So it's like we gave up on that kind of thing. It turns out to be sort of almost one of those kind of tempting fate to set one of those things up. All right, maybe one or two more, and then I should go. Let's see. WWW asks, what's the best way to organize thoughts, ideas, pieces of code, frameworks, and projects when there are hundreds of them? You know, I've had, I think, how many is it? 5 or 6 file systems, 5 or 6 sort of organizational ideas for the file system I use for myself over the course of my life. And so it's kind of like once a decade-ish, I'll kind of change the way I both work and the way I organize my file system. So, for example, what I've done now is every project that I seriously imagine doing has a folder. And there are probably, I don't know, I haven't counted, maybe 100 of these. But I remember all of them. And what I do is whenever something comes in, maybe it's a piece of email, maybe it's a thing I notice, you know, some publication I notice or whatever else. Maybe it's some thing that I worked on with some, you know, it's some live coding thing that I did or something like that. Any of those kinds of things, I put them in the folder for that project. Now, some of these projects I've been meaning to do that project for 30 years, but I put them in that folder, and then when I'm ready to do that project, I'm going to crack open that folder, and then maybe I'll have 100 items in that folder. But by the time I'm really ready to do that project, I'm going to look through all those 100 items, and then they'll all kind of make sense to me. I'll know how they fit in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's one kind of so my main, I would say my main thing, and you know, there are then like categories of thing. So there might be like, I don't know, well, there are, you know, what's a good example? I don't know, personal records of various kinds, or things you know, interactions I have with company X or whatever else. And again, I have a pretty decent hierarchy of sort of ways to just throw things in folders. You know, I kind of learned this when I will tell a little story about, you know, back in the day, I used to have a lot of stuff in physical folders. And at some point when I was probably maybe 17 years old or something, and I was really into science and so on at that time, and working on a bunch of science research type projects and so on, I thought, I'm going to be very clever. I'm going to make up all these folders with all these very cleverly designed categories. I'm kind of almost like I'm a maker of thesauruses or something, where I'm going to come up with these categories of sort of, you know, that thing is an action, that thing is a modifier, that thing's or whatever else. I come up with these, it wasn't those things in the case of these science projects, but I'm going to come up with these very clever categories. And so I filed things away in these clever categories. Sometimes there wouldn't be very many things in each category. And then I discovered, you know, years went by, and it's like, I can't find anything, because there's no way I can get back in that frame of mind of being, you know, when I would see, oh, I filed that paper in this category. Oh, that was a clever category. But that's not what you want, because what you want is to be able to find the thing in the first place. And so what I realized is it's much better to have very broad categories and just know pretty much for certain you threw it in that box. And, you know, there's a moment where you're throwing it in the box, you don't have to think very much about it. And then it just sits in that box for years, decades maybe. And then finally it's like, okay, I'm really interested in what's in that box. Well, now I've got a pile of stuff, but, you know, it's easy. You know, that's the time when you're going to go through that pile of stuff. And you're going to find whatever was relevant, you're going to find at that time. Now, when it comes to sort of the soft version of that, occasionally, not very often, but occasionally I'll make a copy of something and I'll put it in 2 different folders if it sort of spans 2 different interest areas. And I think that's one thing. I mean, the other thing is that I have, you know, archive of email and so on going back 30 years and all my files and so on. And I have kind of this meta searcher that can search for things in all of those different places. And that's super useful, and I wouldn't be able to survive without it, so to speak. I mean, that's my kind of outsourced memory of what's happened in my life and the things I've worked on. Although that's not usually a good place. That's usually a good place to remember people and things and so on. It's not usually a good place to remember what I figured out. By the way, another thing that I've ended up doing is another rather simple-minded thing, but it works very well, is I'll have some topic area. Maybe it'll be in one folder, maybe it'll be multiple topics and multiple subtopics of a folder. I always just, I create these notebooks, Wolfram notebooks, those notebooks are always, I just number them -01, -02, -03, and I don't try and be clever about the names of those things. Sometimes when there's a definite thing that I've done, I'll say, SW notes -02 - and then some topic name, that's some sort of subtopic name that I might be able to find it by. But the fact that I have this sequential order, very obvious sequential order of these things, I find really useful. Now, I have to say, I started doing -01 years ago. I've never gotten to 100. This project that we've been working on recently about meta-mathematics, we're in the 93s or 94s right now of numbered notebooks, and it's going to be very interesting to see. I feel like it's almost, even though we may not need it, it's almost like I just have to really push it right to the end, just so I've done that once and blown out my -01 type scheme, because if you have -01, it sorts correctly with respect to -08 sorts before 10 and so on, and any reasonable sorting system. So anyway, that's kind of a little tip of what I've tried to do to organize things I'm doing, and I find this idea of even if I'm there are projects where I sort of vaguely think about doing them. There are not that many such projects, so I can pretty much, as soon as the thing has differentiated enough from the general things I might be doing in such and such an area, then it'll be something where I can make a definite folder for it, and it's something that I can start throwing things into, and end up expecting that that I may look at it years from now and find everything that was useful there. And this is also a thing that can happen. Even when people send me mail and they say, here's the thing you might be interested in, and it's like I increasingly end up saying, look, I'm not working on that right now. I'm going to put this in this folder for when I am working on it, and that's when I'm going to read it. And I think maybe people don't necessarily believe that's really true, but it really is true, although the time scale for me to get to that folder might be in many years. But that's kind of the process that I'm using there. All right, well, I better wrap up here, but I see lots of interesting questions I would love to respond to, and do that another time. Thanks for joining me, and